when wealth became a burden. It didn't begin with celebration. It began with a silence, so heavy it felt like the air itself had shifted. Wealth had arrived, vast, staggering, unimaginable, yet it didn't bring freedom. It brought something else entirely. A weight, a shadow, a question that refused to disappear. People imagine fortune as a finish line, a moment when struggle fades and life opens like a clear, bright horizon. But for some, fortune is not an ending. It is an awakening, one that reveals a hidden cost of reaching heights few ever see. And today, as wealth grows faster and bigger than ever before, the world faces the same dilemma. What happens when success becomes too heavy to carry? To understand this, we step into the life of a billionaire who never meant to chase power. The rise was unplanned, almost accidental, a sequence of small decisions that spiraled into a fortune beyond any expectation. At first, it felt surreal. Opportunities multiplied, doors opened. The world shifted around the newfound success. Yet each breakthrough carried an unseen consequence that lingered just out of view. In the beginning, the wealth felt manageable. Manageable in the way a rising tide feels gentle, right before it becomes a wave. Praise poured in from every direction. Reporters wanted the story. Investors wanted more growth. Partners wanted bigger plans. It became harder to tell where ambition ended and expectation began. The first reveal occurred in the quiet moments. Late nights when the billionaires stared at the numbers, the charts, the projections. The empire was expanding faster than the heart could process. Wealth was no longer something possessed. It was something that had to be protected, managed, negotiated, defended. It demanded attention at every hour, whispering that one misstep could send everything crumbling. Then came the subtle shift, a decision that seemed harmless, a new acquisition. It was meant to solve a problem, fill a gap, strengthen the foundation. But like all decisions made under pressure, it opened a door to complications no one foresaw. Teams grew nervous. Advisors exchanged glances. The fortune that once felt like a blessing began to take shape as something else, a responsibility that threatened to swallow its creator whole. And in the background, a cost quietly accumulated, the cost of carrying more than any one person should bear. The first cracks were forming, and the story was only beginning to unfold. The burden grew heavier with each passing month. What began as a simple expansion morphed into a labyrinth of obligations. New subsidiaries demanded oversight. Old partnerships strained under shifting priorities. Every decision seemed to generate three more. The billionaire, once energized by possibility, now felt surrounded by an empire that required constant vigilance just to stay upright. The reveal deepened when the acquisition that was supposed to stabilize a company instead exposed hidden problems. Financial reports showed irregularities. Teams uncovered legacy issues buried beneath years of rushed growth. What appeared to be a strategic move had become a ticking clock, counting down toward crisis. The billionaire's advisors urged caution, but caution had become a luxury. The business world expected action, immediate, decisive, flawless. Tension grew inside the executive boardrooms. Every meeting carried a new wave of pressure. Markets shifted unpredictably. Investors demanded clarity. The billionaire couldn't provide. Competitors sensed vulnerability and began encroaching on territory once considered untouchable. The fortune that once promised opportunity was now a fortress under siege. Sleepless nights became routine. The billionaire paced through massive, quiet halls, unable to escape the sense that the wealth itself had transformed into a trap. The responsibility to preserve it outweighed the joy of earning it. The world saw a figure of power, but behind closed doors stood someone slowly unraveling beneath the weight of expectations no human could sustain. The early conflict emerged when key executives pushed back against the billionaire's decisions. They argued the empire was overstretched, that priorities were unclear, that the leader at the center was no longer leading but reacting. It was a subtle mutiny, not loud, not dramatic, but felt in every conversation. A tension beneath the surface, sharp as a blade. Then came the external blow. An investigative report leaked, hinting at trouble within the newly acquired company. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to rattle markets and ignite speculation. Stock prices wavered, calls flooded in. Attorneys prepared statements. The billionaire braced for impact, realizing that a single spark could ignite a fire large enough to consume the entire fortune. The burden was changing form. It wasn't just financial anymore. It was emotional, psychological, existential. Wealth had evolved into a force that controlled every hour, every thought, every decision. And for the first time, the billionaire saw clearly. This was no longer about success. It was about survival. The conflict accelerated the moment the investigation expanded. What began as a minor leak spiraled into a full-scale probe. Regulators demanded documents. Journalists circled like vultures, sensing a wounded animal. Even allies grew distant, afraid of being pulled into a crisis they did not fully understand. The billionaire, once a symbol of unstoppable ascent, now stood at the center of a storm gaining strength by the hour. Inside the company, panic spread with unsettling speed. Departments rushed to defend their roles. Executives argued behind closed doors, each presenting different strategies, none offering certainty. The acquisition, once hailed as a bold step forward, now threatened to unravel the entire empire. Every flaw in the system, every neglected detail, every overlooked risk resurfaced with brutal clarity. The billionaire tried to regain control, but leadership felt like steering a ship through uncharted waters with maps that kept erasing themselves. Decisions required speed, yet every move risked exposing deeper issues. Employees sensed the growing desperation in directives that changed from morning to evening. Rumors filled the hallways. Confidence dissolved into anxiety. Emotionally, the toll became unbearable. The billionaire, once confident and unshakable, felt each headline like a blow. The pressure of protecting thousands of jobs tightened around the chest like a vice. Every new problem felt heavier than the last. The wealth that once promised freedom now dictated every breath, every thought, every waking moment. The board, sensing instability, began exploring options without the billionaire's approval. Consultants were brought in under guise of support, but functioned more like auditors assessing a failing system. Trust eroded. The billionaire felt surrounded by people speaking in careful tones, measuring their words, acting as though the empire's collapse was already a foregone conclusion. The emotional breaking point came during a late-night meeting. A senior advisor delivered a grim assessment. Without drastic changes, the empire could fall within months. Not years, months. Silence filled the room. The billionaire stared at the projections, unable to deny the truth any longer. Wealth had not simply become a burden. It had become a battlefield. And in that silence, a realization surfaced. The greatest threat was no longer external scrutiny or market pressure. It was a system the billionaire had built, a system now turning inward, squeezing tighter with every passing day. The empire demanded sacrifice. It demanded transformation. And before long, it would demand something even greater. The story was racing toward a moment of truth, and the billionaire could feel approaching like a rising tide that could no longer be held back. The climax arrived in a moment that felt both inevitable and surreal. The billionaire stood before the board, facing the people who once celebrated every victory. Now their expressions were carved from stone. Charts, reports, and warnings filled the room, each one echoing the same truth. The empire could not survive under its current weight. Something fundamental had to break, or be rebuilt, with a voice steadier than expected. The billionaire acknowledged what had long been avoided. The fortune had grown too vast to control alone. The responsibilities were no longer human-sized, and holding on out of pride would destroy everything. The board waited breathless as the billionaire announced a radical decision, a complete restructuring, the appointment of new leadership, and a personal step back from the empire's front lines. The room fell silent, not in shock, but in understanding. For months they had felt the foundation strain. Now, at last, someone had the courage to face the truth. The shift was immediate. Executives who had once operated in fear finally saw a path forward. Departments that had drifted aimlessly regained direction. The empire, once suffocating under its own mass, exhaled. Outside the walls of the company, reactions surged across the world. Analysts debated whether this was collapse or evolution. Critics called it retreat. Supporters called it wisdom. But regardless of opinion, one fact became undeniable. The billionaire had done what few at such heights ever dare: let go before everything shattered. In the quiet that followed the announcement, the billionaire retreated to a private office overlooking the city that had witnessed every rise and fall. The skyline shimmered, indifferent to wealth, crisis, or legacy. And in that stillness, a profound truth revealed itself. The burden had never been the money, nor the empire, nor the expectations. The burden was believing it all had to be carried alone. By releasing control, the billionaire reclaimed something far more valuable: clarity, perspective, humanity. Wealth had once felt like a prison. Now it felt like a lesson, one written in risk, pressure, and transformation. And though the empire would continue without its original architect at the helm, its future was stronger because of the decision made in that defining moment. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.